Hello and welcome to the Big Idea podcast from the University of Edinburgh. I'm Edd McCracken. Each month we pick a theme and bring together experts from the university to unpick, explore and dissect that theme. And this month we're looking at what is being called the most pressing humanitarian crisis of our time. According to the UN, there are currently nearly 60 million refugees in the world, the highest number in history. War and persecution has displaced millions of families from their homes in countries such as Syria, Eritrea, Iraq and Somalia. Their desperate flight has inspired increasingly desperate measures, resulting in grisly news stories across Europe this summer. In Austria, 71 refugees suffocating to death in a lorry. In Calais, violent scuffles between authorities and migrants. In Hungary, Budapest's main train station overflowing with refugee families. And on a Turkish beach, the body of a 3-year-old Syrian boy lying face down in the surf. Today we will discuss one of the main causes of this massive displacement, the civil war in Syria. We will look at how the crisis could change the politics and the face of the European Union and ask, in the face of such suffering and need, what can be done? Joining me today we have Dr. Thomas Pierret, lecturer in contemporary Islam and expert in Syria. We have Dr. Steve Kirkwood, lecturer in social work and an expert on asylum seekers and refugees. And we have Nina Perkowski from Politics and International Relations, an expert on EU border management. Thanks very much for joining us today. So in the first instance, we're going to come to Thomas first. And we mentioned there that obviously the civil war in Syria is one of the main kind of reasons for this refugee crisis that we've heard so much about in the past few months. Now it seems like half of Syria's 22 million population has been displaced in the 4 years since the civil war started, 4 million of which have been displaced abroad, mainly to the likes of Lebanon, Turkey and Jordan. But in recent months, we've seen hundreds of thousands coming into Europe as well. I mean, what is the kind of what's happening on the ground that's displacing so many people?
All right. Mass displacement is, to a large extent, and in the case of the overwhelming majority of the refugees, is a result of a deliberate strategy by the Assad regime. It started in 2012. So at the time, the regime lost control of vast parts of the territory to the rebels. And since the regime was unable to retake them because they didn't have enough soldiers to do it, the strategy was to shell these regions, bomb them from the air, besiege them, starve the people inside them, in order to induce a massive displacement of population. Often, actually, the first step was often for these people to move into regions controlled by the regime itself, not of love for the regime, but because these were safer than the regions held by the rebels, because they were not shelled as badly and not bombed from the air at all. And so that is the cause of for the overwhelming majority of the displacement. Then in 2014 there was the rise of ISIS, which led to the displacement of, I would say, probably something in the several hundred thousands of people, mostly Kurds, because when the ISIS tried to take control of regions like Kobane, this entailed a significant displacement of population, although on a much smaller scale than the displacement resulting from regimes' military operations. I would say the overall economic conditions have also deteriorated, also inside regime-controlled regions. And I assume now there is also this prospect of Europe welcoming some part of these refugees, so which I think is pulling a certain number of people outside of Syria.
Okay. Now, obviously, the civil war. I mean, its genesis, short-term genesis, was in the kind of Arab Spring, the kind of popular uprising against Assad, which then, the kind of composition of the rebel forces is certainly kind of seems to have changed over time. But there was talk several years ago of intervening on their behalf to help kind of topple Assad, and there was debates in Parliament about this in the UK. Looking, this is, playing a game of what if. I mean, if the Western forces had intervened more actively at that time to help topple Assad, would we be potentially facing less kind of people fleeing Syria at the minute?
I mean, it's a complicated debate. I have personal views on this. I strongly feel that yes. I mean, it's not just helping the rebels topple Assad. It's more complicated than that. I think what should have been done was to draw red lines, real ones, not like the red lines drawn by Obama, which were actually fake ones.
Like on the use of chemical weapons.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think if it was not about invading Syria like the US invaded Iraq in 2003 and toppling the regime. It was about, I would say, drawing red lines regarding the use of certain weapons, which are the deadliest and the one that entail the most destruction and displacement of population. In particular, air power, because I mean it's a very, very significant factor in the displacement of people, which is why many people, including myself, have been calling for a no-fly zone, which is not equivalent to saying we will go inside Syria and topple Assad. And of course, this should be part of a broader political, process of indeed regime change. But it's in regime change along the lines of, for instance, the Geneva Agreement of 2012, which called for the establishment of a transitional governing body, including members of the regime and members of the opposition. Of course, members of the regime, but not the Assad family. So it was calling for a peaceful transition, which I do think is the best solution. But I think it would be much easier to go in the direction if the regime was deprived of its main element of strength. In my view, a measure like a no-fly zone, it would not entail the collapse of the regime overnight, but it would save many lives, and in my view, create an environment that would be more conducive to a political solution.
I obviously, talk about kind of, military intervention into Syria is kind of back on the table again, very much in light of kind of, the kind of displacement of people coming into Europe. I mean, again, would you urge caution on kind of the likes of David Cameron, talking about kind of, putting boots on the ground, military intervention into Syria?
Well, I think Cameron is talking about boots on the ground, but the kind of intervention that is talked about at the moment, which is already taking place, and which consists in bombing ISIS, is actually irrelevant as far as refugees are concerned, because, and especially since, the last year the Kurds managed to protect their regions against ISIS advance. ISIS is no longer a major factor of displacement for the population. So you can attack them as much as you want. It won't change anything in terms of number of refugees. So, yeah, I mean, if some politicians pretend that they're doing that in order to prevent more refugees to come out of Syria, either they're ignorant or they lie, but it's not related.
Okay. Now, looking at the kind of the general kind of area around Syria, I mean, what are Syria's neighbours kind of doing to kind of, help resolve the civil war crisis, but then also in terms of refugees as well?
Well, I mean, you can hardly say that neighbors are helping resolve the civil war. But I mean, all of them are involved on one side or the other. Let's say, Turkey strongly supports the opposition and the rebels. Jordan supports them a bit less vocally, but still. Whereas Lebanon and Iraq, or at least the dominant political forces in Lebanon and Iraq, are strongly with the regime and are even sending their own fighters to support the regime. But they're taking in a lot of refugees, whether they like it or not. I would say, in very different conditions. The best situation is probably Turkey, because it's the wealthiest neighbor of Syria. It's also the largest one, so it's not such a burden on Turkish resources as it is in Lebanon, which is a small country where perhaps the refugee population is equivalent to 25% of the population, which is massive. And it's also a country with very strong sectarian tensions, and the flow of Syrian refugees is adding to that. I'm not saying you don't have that at all in Turkey, but it's much less prominent, so situation is better. Also, I mean, so far the Turkish government has an openly and vocally pro-refugee policy, to the extent that the refugees have been, in Turkish politics, there is this sharp divide with the government being pro-refugees and the opposition being anti, or at least let's say the Turkish nationalist opposition being anti. I mean, it's good for the refugees as long as the current party is in power. Of course, if things were to change, it would be different.
What about the Gulf states? I mean, because people do talk about, in a probably about of kind of what about them kind of isms, when it comes to kind of accepting refugees, they look to kind of very wealthy neighbouring countries, not so much to the north and west and to Europe, but kind of, in the Gulf states. I mean, is there no willingness to kind of take part in alleviating the refugee crisis there?
Yeah, I mean, it's of course more complicated than this, what we hear. I would say on the one hand, it's true that these are states that are very reluctant to get new people because they already have a massive expatriate population, including a very large number of Syrians, right, even before the war. And as in some of these countries, especially the Emirates, or at least in some Emirates, you have more expatriates than locals. So it has a political impact to welcome new people. Especially, I mean, these are strongly, I would say, politically conservative or even reactionary states. So they're not especially eager to have new people who might have revolutionary ideas. At the same time, when you read that they have welcomed 0 Syrians since 2011, it is not true. Simply because there are many people who are not officially accounted for as refugees, but who have joined family that was already working in one of these countries. And I don't have figures, but I think it's a fairly large number of people who manage to seek refuge de facto in these states, even if it's not understood as officially as refugees. And also these states are, I think, also contributing to a large extent to the financing of humanitarian operations around Syria, especially because they want refugees to stay there. So they would rather fund a refugee camp in Jordan, for instance, than welcome the people who are in that camp.
And just finally then, can I ask about kind of, Russia seems to be kind of very much in the background when we talk about Syria, and especially when kind of resolutions coming before the UN, and Russia's willingness to kind of veto kind of anything that kind of would go against the Assad regime. What is their relationship there, and what factor could they play in terms of resolving this potentially?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very old relationship. There is a military treaty dating back to the early 80s between Syria and the Soviet Union. So it was a strategically ally of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And they remain, to an extent, an ally after that. The Russians have a naval base in Tartus on the Syrian coast. I mean, it's a small one, but it's still theirs. And after 2011, I think that the Russians have always had this very same position, which is, we support Assad, whatever happens. Now the situation is changing because Assad has been losing ground over the last months. So there are an increasing number of reports about direct Russian military involvement in Syria, with probably small-scale ground component, perhaps a larger air component in the coming months, which I think will just prolong the war because it will make Assad feel that he can go on without compromising. And that I think this is really, really pushing us away from this dream of a negotiated transition. So I think, what Russia's role at the moment is very counterproductive in my perspective.
So you're not overly hopeful for the future in terms of finding a resolution for the situation?
Not at all,
soon?
Unfortunately, no. I think we're not at all going in that direction. More refugees to come, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, we're certainly going to talk more about that in part 2 of the podcast. So that's the end of part 1. Stick with us for part 2 in just a second.